Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's Fourth Space. Welcome back for our second event of the day. This one event, How Do You Picture It? A presentation and a discussion on alt texts and art books. And to help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube live from Fourth Space. We are located here on unceded Indigenous lands in Chichage, Montreal. Fourth Space, we work with the university community to help mobilize knowledge, daily activities that examine research questions, projects, things happening across the university. And we're running today's event as a live stream Zoom meeting also. So anyone joining us there, if you have any comments or questions, that would be fantastic. Just pop them into the chat. We can read them out, or you can turn on your mic and ask during the Q&A section. Those of you here in the space, if you have any questions, just raise your hand. We'll bring a microphone over to you. Okay. Now, just to introduce things, to get us started, I'm going to pass it over to Ryan Van Housey, Interim Director and Acquisitions Editor of the Concordia University Press. Welcome back, Ryan.
Thank you so much, Douglas. Thank you, everybody, for joining us in person and online. I'd like to first introduce Mehrnoosh Alborzi, who's a graduate student in the art history department here at Concordia University. And Mehrnoosh is the first Elspeth McConnell Fine Arts Award internship with Concordia University Press. We've really had a chance to kind of benefit from her own expertise working in art history, but also previously in healthcare related fields, in order to kind of grapple with a back catalog of alt text descriptions for our own titles. Alt texts are digitally coded textual information to provide oral descriptions of images that appear within books. It's an accessibility feature that is more inclusive to people with visual impairments, or perhaps from different learning styles, if you receive information better when it's read aloud. There's a number of ways to go about drafting alt texts and providing those descriptions, and there's a whole bunch of guidebooks that are out there, or kind of guidance for them, but they don't often always reconcile, and they are for different kinds of images, which can often be the case. So sometimes guidebooks or guidelines will have recommendations for say an online resource, but it can be more challenging when you're dealing with artistic related material. So I wanted to first kind of just give a sense here of a few examples of how texts might be too short, or kind of in a medium range, or how they could be too long and extensive. So I just drafted up 3 examples here, which I will play, and then we will show you the actual image. Oh, all right. Now we're ready. Okay, so I'm going to play this, and then you can see how sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. Sometimes there's room for improvement, and we're going to get into this kind of discussion with Mehrnoosh in a moment.
Test. Option 1. A black and white photo of a man doing something with a wig. Option 2. A black and white photo of a male presenting figure standing beside a microphone removing a wig. Option 3. A book cover shows a black and white photo of a stage or studio space, with visible lighting, a microphone, and a screen for projection. A male presenting figure dressed in dark clothes and boots is standing, face turned in profile, and is removing a wig from his head. Overlaid text indicates the title of the book, more voiceover, Colin Campbell Writings, and the author credit edited by John Davies.
So here's the actual image. But how much can we expect? Somebody's going to want to hear all of that description. And also the coding for alt texts can be limited to 150 characters. But then there are additional ways of adding layers of description following that first 150 character limit. So just to kind of give you a sense of the way that we're going to proceed today, Mehrnoosh and I are going to have a discussion that really is example driven. Much like this just recording here, where we're actually going to look at images that appeared in Concordia University Press books to show what particular challenges there were in describing certain kinds of imagery, and just to kind of be a skill share here to provide considerations for other people that are also wanting to be more inclusive for accessibility needs with their own publications, whether that's books or whether that's online articles or website content. We really kind of want to open this up, and then I'm going to turn the floor over to Rachel Harris, who is our scholarly publishing librarian here at Concordia University. She's grappled with some of these similar questions with the Open Educational Resources program that she oversees, which are really open free textbooks, right? So Rachel will be asking those here in the audience to share if they have any examples. And then I know that there's some folks that are joining us online as well. So if you have anything that you want to add or share, we don't want this to be a presentation where we're saying, we've figured it all out, we know the best way to do this. No, we have some considerations. And we would appreciate hearing from you as well. We also have coffee and snacks available if anybody here in person wants to seek some refreshment. Thank you, Rachel, for joining us. Thank you, Mehrnoosh, for joining us. Why don't we jump right into it? Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you, Ryan, for that great introduction. And I'm going to start with 3 brief definitions just to distinguish between captions, alt text, and descriptions. So captions are what we're mostly familiar with, is that text that accompanies an illustration in a book. Captions could be non-existent or could be several paragraphs long, but in my experience, they are not there to be a substitution of the image, because there's this assumption by the author that, well, you're seeing the image.
Right.
So they include additional information. So alt texts, on the other hand, are supposed to provide some substitution to the image. It's a visual description of the image and its content. And as you mentioned, they're very short. 150 characters is very short. It's basically a line and a half, barely. And usually they're structured as sentence fragments, not even a sentence. Then you have descriptions or long descriptions, and they could be several paragraphs long. And this is where you can provide a detailed and comprehensive description of the image. That said, it's important, it can be multiple paragraphs long, but it shouldn't, because, well, our resources are limited, but so is the patience of the screen reader user. So I kind of ended up limiting myself to like a short paragraph, 130 words, let's say. And then if it's necessary, I will add more and I will show you the strategies I use.
Great.
So what to keep in mind?
Good start.
Yeah, as Ryan, you said, this is going to be an example-driven presentation for good reasons, because when I started this internship as an overthinker, I spent the first 2 weeks researching and reflecting, and then Ryan was like, why don't you learn by doing? Words of wisdom, actually, in life, learn by doing, and especially for writing alt text as an art form, you learn by doing. There's no amount of research you can do that will make you know how to how to write alt text. You have to do it. But that said, before jumping into the examples, there are these 3 questions / theoretical framework / reflections I would like you to have in mind. And these are the questions that I had to ask myself each time I encountered an image. What to describe when you see an image, what to describe of all the visual data present in an image, and how much to describe in how much detail, and then how to describe. So what words you're using, what language, what adjectives. So keep these in mind. And with that, we're going to start.
Diving in. Yeah, so I know I said off the top that, there are different needs and considerations for various kinds of images. And this is one that's taken from a website. And you're like, so in some ways, I feel like a shorter description is adequate enough because it's not necessarily being invested with the same theoretical or methodological kind of weight of an art object, right? But if an image like this were a still from an art text, what would we do with it?
Yeah.
So we have this example here, which is just riders participate in an indoor cycling class at Le Gym's Spin Studio, Concordia University's downtown fitness center. But we know that these things can get more complicated.
Yeah. So here we're starting from like the simplest examples and going into more complicated cases, but it's not actually a stock photo. It's a photo from Concordia's website for best alt text writing practices. And this alt text is actually an example provided by Concordia University. And this is roughly 150 characters. You see how limited that is. And it's good, as you said, probably this image would be on Concordia's University as sort of a promotional, we have great facilities here. But imagine, as you said, this photo as part of an art series about by an artist who works on labor and sports and gender. Then
yeah, sure.
This is not sufficient.
Yeah.
So what we need is to add description. So 150 characters will not be enough for our purposes. So starting with
yeah, so there's a few images here. I like the transition here because what we're getting into, the details in the previous alt text description did not include any details about physical features, age, gender, ethnicity, and race. Nobody was nude in that one, but that is an additional point that we have here for especially the Colin Campbell works. But yeah, so at what point do those sorts of factors like physical features, age, gender, ethnicity, and race, when do you decide that they are important within the work itself, within the context of the book, or within the image? And then how did you start to think about altering your approach to the descriptions?
So this kind of 4 characteristics came about from me looking at multiple guidelines, and they all were like, okay, for describing people, keep these 4 characteristics in mind. And people are subject matters of artworks, very popular subject matters of artworks. So you will encounter people in artworks, but also art books are not just artworks.
Yeah.
You will always have an image of the artist, as you can see here.
Yeah, so this is Lionel Lemoyne Fitzgerald, taken in, I think, the last couple of years of his life.
Yeah.
And that's from our work, Some Magnetic Force, which was edited by Michael Park Taylor. So it's kind of more of a documentary photo rather than like an art portrait, but it is showing him next to one of his artworks. I believe that's one of his artworks.
So, for example, physical features that you need to describe, many guidelines would say, well, the most prominent physical feature or age or gender and ethnicity. In all these cases, the most important point is to be respectful and sensitive, but easier said than done. Because if I say that, you say, of course, but easier said than done. I included this example because based on this guideline, my description was like older balding man.
No offense taken.
So it's not, and then I wondered, why is that's not how I would want to be? Is that necessary? Is that an important? Yes, sure, it's the most prominent physical feature that caught my eyes, but then maybe describing his attire and the way he's seating is actually more important in kind of conveying who he is as a character. And age, okay, older. I had the information in the book that, well, it is in his later, in the later stages of his life.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to gender and ethnicity and race, the most important thing that all the guidelines tell you is just not to assume. So not assuming that someone is the way they're presenting is any definition of their gender. So don't use gender-specific pronouns. For example, in this, the corner, okay, this is not working, sorry. Oops, sorry. I was trying to get, okay, the image in the bottom right.
Yeah, of Colin Campbell.
This is Colin Campbell, and actually this book deals with gender ambiguity quite a lot.
Yeah.
So this is Colin Campbell, who is, defines himself as a man. So in the book, the pronouns used is him, but here he is playing the character woman and Malibu woman.
Yeah.
So based on this information, this is how I would use the pronouns to describe the character in the image. Otherwise, you don't, if you don't know, you don't use gender-specific pronouns. The same goes with ethnicity and race. Now, there's something in guidelines that I found a bit still doesn't sit right with me. And it's like they advise you to use emoji skin tones.
Okay.
I know, right? And emoji skin tones in themselves are problematic because they're basically 5 characters, 5 categories: light skin, medium light, medium dark, and dark skin. I personally don't like describing myself as a medium dark skin. It sounds like medium well done. I don't know. It just doesn't sound well. Yes. And also there's, well, if you know the race, and sometimes the race plays an important part, you have to name what you see. But basically the idea is don't assume. Yeah. So here in the image in the middle, well, the figure you see at the center, them being a Black woman is an important part of who this person is, and it is kind of referred to in the book. So based on the context of the image, so you describe this person as a Black woman. Otherwise, well, you don't assume.
That's from Alex Ketchum's Ingredients for Revolution, where this is one of the prominent sites that was featured in the book as a feminist restaurant, cafe, coffee house, and Mary Watkins was a regular. I think this is at the Brick Hut. Her race is certainly mentioned, as well as her musicianship and like the whole milieu that she was a part of at this establishment. So I think often we are seeing that the context of the book itself is important to the alt text description.
Yes, and also nudity is not a characteristic, but it's something that we encounter a lot in art. Yes. Often in problematic like in a problematic setting, usually in paintings, there's like race and gendered, it enforces race and gendered power dynamics. But the point, I included it because it's important to describe the nudity in a way that is sensitive and also that doesn't necessarily come off as vulgar and offensive to people, because this is something I've actually encountered. And just describe what you see. So you don't need to include your own, just describe what you see. So here in this example, you can see there was no caption accompanying this image, and this particular image, the context didn't give me much information. I describe these 2 figures as figures or individuals. I didn't use like gender-specific pronouns. The character in the back, I describe them as light skin with reddish hair, because that's what I see. And then, for example, for describing the nudity, again, what I see is like their bare backs suggest they could be naked. That's it, because that's what I'm seeing. Right. And then you can see here that there's an alt text and there's a description. Going forward, this is what we will see, because as we explained, like 150 characters is never enough for describing images such as this. So you have your alt text, and then you go ahead and you add a short description. And the descriptions are that we chose kind of like a word limit of 130 words, like a short paragraph still, to describe what, more complicated images.
Yeah. Let's the next slide. Oh, we're getting into artworks. Yes. Okay. Do you want to talk a bit about some of the guidelines that you were consulting here and how they were helpful or how they weren't?
So the most kind of comprehensive guideline that I could find for describing artworks, and I know that's a very, very broad term. At the same time, it could be a reductive term, because what we consider as artworks are basically fine art, very Western. But that aside, based on Cooper Hewitt Museum of Design, I think, guidelines. And so that was very useful. That being said, because of my training as an art historian, emerging art historian in training, I still don't know how to define myself. But This is more familiar to me, but in general, when you're the core aspects of describing artworks are the subject matter, so what is being painted or photographed, what have you, the size of the image, the artwork, and the size of the elements within it, the color, the orientation and relationships of the items to each other. And then medium and style are also, for the quote-unquote connoisseur, could be very effective ways of conveying how an image looks like. So if you describe the medium or the style, you're already halfway there of giving a good sense of the image. That said, it needs to be accurate because you're writing in art books or scholarly books, you're writing for a learned audience. For example, terms like modern are used to like thrown around too often. So if you're using, for example, for describing, it needs the medium, you need to know actually what you're talking
Even
about.
among scholars, there's a lot of medieval Renaissance scholars that will say modern, and they mean like the 15th or 16th century.
Yes.
And you're like, oh, okay, not the 20th, right? Not modernism. Okay, right? Yes.
Yeah. So it depends again based on your audience, the context. But what I mean is like you have to do research. I wasn't a scholar. You might be a scholar on one artwork, but you're not on the others. So you have to do some research to accurately describe. And then I added myself the final element, which is an interpretive quality, such as mood.
Yeah.
And like an anecdote, as art history students, the first assignment they give you in undergrad is a visual analysis. So visual analysis is basically describe an artwork. And that was my lowest grade in undergrad.
I remember you sharing that with me before.
because you're not supposed to introduce your interpretations. A visual analysis, a description is a description. And we're so keen, we're there to start to interpret, and like the descriptions are just there for us to start interpreting an artwork, but that's not what the point is. You have to describe, remain descriptive, and if you want to kind of smuggle in a little interpretation, it has to be first kind of backed up by evidence in a way, by the formal elements. So let's say the example, the image at the bottom right, I couldn't refrain from describing it at the end as dramatic. But well, there's a person standing tall on a stage, wearing a long trench coat, hands on his belt. There's lightning behind him, for God's sake, so the dramatic lighting. So then at the end, having described all of that, I say, okay, all of this gives the image a dramatic quality, but this don't overdo it. And first describe the visual elements, let the person make up their own mind. And then there is also a difference between figurative artworks and non-representational or abstract artworks. Each one presents its own unique challenge. And then there is also, finally, on Cooper US guidelines, the structure of the description, how to structure a description, meaning how do you write the description, basically, the outline of the description depends on the context. This is where I want to emphasize the importance of the context, where the image is. So in this case, in an art book, do I describe, and then you're supposed to describe the most important element first, and then add the details. But what is the most important element? Depends on the context, right? So if the image is about, for example, the use of colored green, I would start with by describing the green object. If it's about representation of books, I will describe the book first and then add those details. And then it's also important to consider the context of the description. Where is my description presented? Because I'm working here with scholarly books, my description would be very different from if I was describing artworks for a museum, for example. We'll get into that more later. So the example I picked here, you want to?
Oh, sure. Yeah. This is a drawing or is it a painting? I can't remember now.
Good point. And
Right?
I will
Yeah.
actually.
Also from some magnetic force.
Yes.
So this is a Lionel Lemoyne Fitzgerald artwork. But this is one of those moments where I have a stop and pause. I'm like, wait, is it a photo negative? Is it a drawing? Is it a painting?
Great point, actually.
And what is it, Mehrnoosh?
Great points.
Oh, I see it
You
in the
walked
alt
right
text now.
into my trap.
Good.
So I chose this artwork because it's something between, it's kind of both abstract and figurative. So I wanted to just say how I describe these shapes that you see as, for example, swirling forms or cloud-like formations. This is one strategy to kind of describe more abstract and non-representational things. But the caption, "The Harvest Season," which is the title of the artwork, gives it a little bit away. But still, I refrain myself from introducing my own. So now I'm like, oh, maybe those piles are like haystacks. But I refrain from.
It's ambiguous.
It's ambiguous.
Yeah.
So is my description.
Yeah.
And good thing that you mentioned, what is it? I was actually asking, what is it? And it is a print. It's a linocut print. And it's very important. I had to go and research. So this information wasn't in the book. I had to go and research and find out what the medium is. And describing the medium is very important as an art historian making, I know, because it immediately gives you a sense of how the image looks like. Describing the medium is a very effective way sometimes of kind of giving giving a description of the image.
Yeah. Okay. Now I remember we had this conversation. So I think now we're getting into like matters of expertise and specialization. And this is getting into a highly technical field because these are architectural drawings, photos of actualized sites, but then also a site map plan. So at the left, we have a plan from Cornelia Hahn Oberlander, which appears in our second book in the Building Arguments series that we've co-published with the Canadian Centre for Architecture. Now, I think this is a site plan. I can't remember if it was for the Center for Creative Play, but it's a playground that I think that she designed for Expo 67. Oh, wow. Okay, the memory's still working. That's good. And then we have a photograph of the fully constructed Simon Fraser University campus in the middle. That's by Arthur Erickson. That appears in Arthur Erickson on Learning Systems, the first book in the Building Arguments series. And on the right, we have one of his architectural drawings of the site plan. So how do you start to describe the technical aspects of architectural drawings? Uh-oh, are we losing something there?
No.
No, we're all good?
Okay.
Okay, so this is one of those moments, I think, where what you were kind of just saying with the last slide of the lino cut from Fitzgerald, you kind of sometimes have to start doing some research to figure out, okay, what are the terms that I need to use here? Because a plan is different than an elevation. There's a facade drawing as well. So what did you end up doing with these troubling but rather lovely images?
So that's a good point that you brought up. We encounter a lot of architectural images in art history, despite the fact that we have no training in architecture.
Very technical trade.
And actually, architectural history is often taught in architecture, so it's in a different faculty altogether. So what you said, you have to start doing research, and you have to assume that the person reading this book might be very well an architect. So, but might not be an architect. So you have to do research to find out those terms, as you said, elevation, site plan, perspective. And then another, going back to describing artworks as well, another effective way of describing architecture is naming the style. But again, that requires some knowledge and expertise. So in this case, for example, it's the perspective. The caption already uses that word, so I don't use that word. I don't repeat the caption. but I describe this as a modernist building, and not modernist in the sense that we call it all buildings that are rectangular modernist. It is an actually a modernist building. And in the description, I describe those qualities that make this building modernist, like, for example, the horizontal lines, the use of pilotis, so that's the architectural term, or columns. So for those people who don't know what a pilotis is. So yeah, the takeaway here is, well, using technical terms and requires research.
Yep. Right. And then this kind of, in some ways, brings us back to two of the considerations, not just the need to obtain context or even conduct research within the text or outside of the text to describe specialized historical objects, like this coconut cup. If you can believe it, somehow that was a coconut at one point. This appears in Old Media and the Medieval Concept, which was edited by Thor Brylo and Stephen Yeager, and this I think comes from Kathleen Kennedy's chapter in that book. So this is from the, I think, 13th or 14th century. And then there's this manuscript page as well. But then the second element that we're kind of returning to is in looking at colonialist objects and how to present those sensitively. So we have a coat of arms here, as well as a map from, I believe it's the 17th century. I don't think that one is Brebeuf. I can't remember, but that appears in both of these images that I'm just discussing appear in Lauren Beck's Canada's Place Names and How to Change Them, as well as this wampum belt in the bottom right. So how did you kind of disentangle some of the complexities of describing these sorts of objects without necessarily imparting or reproducing biases that occur from colonialist objects like a coat of arms?
So that's a great point that you made. So objects, we think objects, but there's also the need to be sensitive describing objects, because objects could be culturally significant, sacred even, or have problematic histories. So the way sometimes to address that is, well, sometimes you just name it, you describe what you see. If it's problematic, well, the object, it is problematic. But in general, I also wanted to talk more generally about objects. It's a very broad term again. I would like to say weird and wonderful objects, which is something that we encounter a lot in art history. That's one of the joys of art history, is that I don't know even what I'm looking at. So you said the coconut cup, I didn't know what I was looking at. It's a coconut cup. And then also turns out I don't know how to describe a cup again, because we don't go about our days describing cups. So these are very specialized items. These chapters are written by specialists for specialists. So just to know what you're describing, what you're seeing, and then also what to describe, you have to go back and look at the context. And for this specific book, you showed me the book, and I was surprised that it has so few images. I was like, that's it? Because I spent so much time on this book, because each chapter is different.
Sure.
Basically, I read the whole chapter to describe this image, just to see what I'm looking at,
right,
and what to describe. So in the case of the manuscript, if it was about, let's say, medieval illumination, I would describe the S shape at the top, but it's about something else. Or for describing the coconut cup, actually, I researched so many museum websites,
right,
just to acquire, again, the vocabulary of describing cups. Again, you're writing for more specialized audience. When it comes to Canada's coat of arms, there's a whole vocabulary associated with heraldry.
Yeah.
So now I know too much about heraldry. So there are words for describing all these elements, but as you said, so it's a problematic, that book is addressing how so many problematic place names, including Canada's coat of arms. So I had to again go and do research and then describe all these symbols and what they're associated with, just to be able to convey why this image is included. In the next example that I brought in another coat of arms, coat of arms of the province of Nova Scotia, it is highly problematic because you have a chained unicorn. That's the official term for a chained unicorn. Again, I had to research what these elements are, especially for the longer description, the Saint Andrew's cross, the lion rampant, or the standing lion in the middle of the shield. And the problematic, especially problematic aspect is the figure to the right of the shield, which is an indigenous man with Caucasian features. That I wasn't comfortable writing that, but it is what it is. And actually, this is what the book is also talking about.
Yeah, Lauren really gets into those discussions as well. Yeah.
Especially because usually coat of arms, they're not held by people usually. So that's also an interesting aspect. So I was uncomfortable writing that. It is what it is at some point.
Right.
It's still the coat of arms of.
Yeah. Oh dear.
Oh dear.
What do you do here? Oh, okay. So what we have here is a series of video stills, also from more voiceover Colin Campbell writings. And so we have a whole series of photos where you kind of get a sense of the kinetic activity of what appears to be like a hangout or a conversation between people. But then I can see how you probably saw this in the book and you thought, oh, what have I gotten myself into with this project? And I'm very sorry. You know, you have to make choices about whether or not to describe all, which I'm assuming you did not do, because in some ways the grouping of this set of images is what's even more important, right? Like it's, if we only wanted to one image, only one image would have been reproduced in the book, right? But this is something that's supposed to be showing a broader range of activity. So how did you kind of think this one through, and then what did you ultimately write down?
Oh boy. So this book, this particular project gave me a bit of a difficult time, not complaining. So how to deal with the issue of seriality? Seriality is something that comes up a lot in post-structuralist, postmodern art of the 70s and the 80s. So basically what you see, you just have a lot of the same image, but slightly different over and over. Well, one thing is that, as you said, like, don't describe everything. And I described basically difference between the images.
Oh, that's interesting.
So that's like, remember the game, like that was one of my favorite kind of games, in that you have two images and you have to detect the differences.
Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah.
So basically that's
an anti-matching exercise.
Okay, great. Thank you. There's a name for it. So for example, in this case, these two stills at the bottom follow the two stills at the top. So in the first two stills, I described a little bit the setting and the characters, but in the second still, I was like, okay, you already have that information. I'm not describing that again. So I went ahead and focused more on the actions that are taking place. And then when I talk about seriality, that is particularly present in this book, my strategy for conveying that was repeating the same repetition in my language. So not out of laziness, but actually it was thought I would copy paste the same text and then just change the words, just so that that repetitiveness of the text conveys the repetitiveness of the image. So like the person who's reading just sees that over and over again, I'm just using the same words,
right? But
because over and over again, you're seeing the same image and slightly different.
Repetition being key.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Oh yes. So now here's another. So these are also images that are from Alex Ketchum's Ingredients for Revolution, where she reproduces a lot of ephemera that was found in various archives that were these are often like event posters from the various feminist restaurants, cafes, and coffee houses that were in the US from the 70s through the 80s. These are very text heavy images because they're like literally flyers, advertising dances or special events. So in these situations, how much of the visual image do you want to describe, and how much of it do you want to transcribe the actual text that's appearing in it? Because this text is not necessarily being reproduced in the book itself.
No, actually, this is one of these was one of our dilemmas, the text-heavy images in the book Ingredients for the Revolution. Because we encountered a lot of these images. They could be posters, menus, magazines, social media posts. We will encounter them in artworks as well. And the issue was basically transcribe or not. And also, again, you have also a lot of visual data, a lot of decorative elements. Do I describe those or not? So, for example, in this example, the Women's Coffee House poster for Sydney Spencer performance concert. And you can see the caption that doesn't even describe, it's not even about the poster, it's more like a general caption. So after reading the poster and looking at it, in the alt text, I decided to include more of the textual elements than the visual elements, because I thought, well, with the given the limited space, the fact that this is for women only and chemically free concert is more important than, for example, okay, there's a photo of Sydney Spencer there. In the description, I will describe what I could see. I thought, for example, in this case, as opposed to the previous slide, in the middle, you have a lot of like musical notes, musical instruments. Are they important to describe? Maybe not, or the dots. But here, there's a Triskelion symbol. And for those who don't know, I also go ahead and briefly describe a Triskelion symbol as, I don't see, but okay. 3 spirals curving outward from a central point. Why did I include that? Because these books are for scholars. And just in my experience with my profs, they can be the most interested in the smallest details.
True.
Especially when they're reading something that is within their field of specialty. And I am someone who's interested in that time period. So it's interesting for me too. I was like, why is there a Triskelion symbol? This is a very simply designed, and you can see in the alt text, all the visual information I give is simply designed poster.
Yeah.
It's a simply designed poster. Why is this element there? It might hold some value, and I add it. And then the text is a very interesting text, a block of text, but in the description, I just say, well, it's a block of text about feminist culture and Sydney Spencer's music. Again, I highlight the more important textual information, how it's chemically free, for women only. But at the end of the day, I'm like, this text is important. This text is like a manifesto. It's an important text. It's an interesting text. And I could completely see a scholar being like, I want to know what's written there. Or when there are menus, for example, from these coffee houses, I was like, there might be a scholar who might find a research question within the menu items present and their prices. So I'm like, they should know. They might be interested. So at the end, I'm like, well, the poster is transcribed below. I transcribe most of these text-heavy images. I transcribe if I thought that the information could be of interest to a scholar. But it's important to do this 2-part kind of description and give like maybe a more like a gist of the information in the description. And then give that option of, okay, if you want to know more, follow the description.
From simplicity to complexity.
Yes, so that the person might be like, I don't know, I don't want to hear what is in the poster. So they can just go
Okay.
ahead and skip it. Well, oh.
Yes. So we got you on this one, I think.
Yeah.
A couple of our text context Canadian artist writing series titles. They include artist books, reproductions of them. And I know Campbell at least has some text, but I remember there's one that's called Four Notable Bakers, and Liz Magor's Subject to Change, which is just images, and there are no words in that entire chapter. So how do you describe a kind of book that's reproduced within a book?
How do you describe books within a book? It's like a Matryoshka doll.
Yes,
Yeah.
very good. Yeah.
So all these points that I talked about, describing images, artworks, text, and seriality, culminates in describing a book because it includes all of them.
Yeah.
So again, describing the relationship of the image to the text, describing the general page layout, describing the images, and then kind of giving an idea about what is in the text, the context of the content of the text, excuse me. So here in this example, the first page of No Voiceover by Colin Campbell, in the alt text, I just say, well, it's a page layout. And by Colin Campbell, featuring a correspondence between fictional characters, because that's what it is. So I give just a very brief description of the context, the text, and then an image of an Egyptian sarcophagus again, because that's all the space I have. And I think it might be a good idea, at least, to start with a description. And then if you want to include both a description and an alt text, to start with a description, then write your alt text using your description, because it's such a short, like it's such a limited space that you kind of have to play around, be like, so what can I fit in there?
Using the medium to your advantage.
Yeah.
Right.
So then in the longer description, I go ahead and describe a bit more about what is happening in the text. It's like a conversation between fictional characters talking about this and that. And then I describe the relationship between the image and the text, the page layout, and then I describe the image in more detail. But then again, I go ahead and be like, well, transcription follows, because my thinking was that the author of the book gave us access to these art books in its totality. So the person using a screen reader should also have access to the art book in totality. So they have access to all the text in the book. And yeah, so I transcribed it. Very late, I learned that also we will talk more about the use of AI. That's something that you could use sometimes, depending on if you have access. Actually, we can talk a little bit more about that. But at least we're transcribing text.
Sure.
So you don't have to.
And then then there's the trouble of graphs, charts, and tables, which often are so thoroughly data rich that the reason they're being displayed in this visual way is to communicate such a great amount of information that would be quite long and difficult to discern if it were only textually conveyed, right? What do you do in those situations? Like, do you reproduce all the information that's being shown on this timeline of when these various feminist restaurants, cafes, and coffee houses were in operation? That's the timeline that we have on the right. And then there's the sort of a triangle of trying to figure out how to create feminist principled food, which was then turned into this triangular graph on the left by Alex Ketchum. These are, I think, in some ways almost like easier graphs or charts or tables, because when we turn to topics in the social sciences, I mean, there's a book that we published not that long ago, Not All Fun and Games, that is like the product of 15 years of research and like thousands of surveys with video game designers, and then hundreds of quantitative interviews as well. And how do you you got to write it all out, I guess. So
Yeah.
what did you do for these ones? I'm curious.
Oh, great point, because luckily in art books,
Yes.
we don't encounter. So those are the only two charts or graphs I encountered, and which is an interesting coincidence, because it's one that is very simple. So you just describe what you see, and one that is very data rich.
Yeah.
Actually, there are a lot of websites and guidelines about how to write alt text for visual data. They're mainly for sciences. But in this case, that was also something that we pondered a lot about what to include, and well, all the information we thought is important to include, but how to present it. Because visual data is interesting. Why do we visualize data? It's to make data, which is kind of textual, to make it more accessible, right? To us.
Yeah, now we're reverse engineering it.
No, we're reverse engineering it.
Yeah.
In this case, so the caption already provides some information about what the image is a timeline of the years of operation of feminist restaurants. So in the alt text, I try to avoid repetition. So I just name the graph title and just the timeline, that is from 1970 to 2022, and then the location. So that is all the space I had. Again, that's why it's important to have the description first, so that you know, okay, based on the space I have, what can I fit in the alt text? And then in the description, I go ahead and describe more of what I see. In this case, it was a little bit, and it's still open to discussion, how to present this data. And at the end, based on some research that I've done, I decided to present the data in a table. So you can see at the bottom, it's a table, it's a part of a table. So I just included the first two rows: name of the enterprise, location, and years active. So for example, an example is Bread and Roses, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Northeast, sorry, and then years active 1975 from 1978. Now, it's important to keep in mind that not all tables are accessible. And from my understanding, a screen reader would just read from left to right as if there are no cells. So if here, imagine just that you read like that in a row. Bread and Roses, Cambridge, 1975 to 1978. It still makes sense, right? But imagine if it was numbers. So it would be Bread and Roses 1, 2.5%, 32, 98. Yeah. That's not accessible. So it's important to make a table that is accessible. And again, tables are usually more easily navigated by more experienced screen reader users.
Right.
So then so that's part of the table then. And then
Okay.
So
yeah, so I feel like that example-driven presentation of how you grappled with some of these issues that appear as a result of the complexity of images have really kind of like narrowed down into these themes here. I think we're very lucky that you've had the chance to kind of approach this topic with fresh eyes from the very beginning, and then reflect on this and present to us what, like, the kind of tracing of your thought process, and then how you put it into practice. And so I'm curious about how you want to summarize these challenges and kind of provide maybe some suggestions to other people that are also approaching the topic of alt text descriptions.
So first things first, it was very challenging. I didn't expect, because you think alt text or descriptions are all technical, right? It was very challenging, and these are not the only challenges I faced, but the main 4 challenges. One was the guideline, or rather the lack of a guideline, for better or worse. And now I actually think maybe for the better. As someone who likes to kind of follow 1, 2, 3 step-by-step instructions, I like using recipes. That's what I set out to do. I set out to find one such guideline. And then once I didn't find one such guideline, I tried to make my own guideline. And then at the end, I barely referred to it, because it's an art form. And like all art form, you learn by doing, as you said. So you kind of get a feel for it. But still, I think there is still a necessity for having guidelines. Then there's a language, and what I mean by this is I hadn't considered before how we are all writers in multiple languages, and I don't mean French or English. I mean, we write administrative English. We write art. For example, dabble in art writing. I do art historical, scholarly, academic writing.
Yep.
I have done scientific writing. I do administrative writing. I
Yep.
also do like messaging my friends text kind of a
Sure.
writing. So what style of writing to
Register
yeah. for this? And I would say it depends on the context.
Yeah.
In the context of these scholarly art books, I found that I developed, and it's important to develop a cohesive, coherent language that you're going to use for the entirety of the book, right?
Yeah.
You don't want it to be like, shit, the person, like how many people wrote that?
Right.
It was a very simple, neutral, maybe closer to my administrative email writing.
Okay, yeah.
Because you want the description to be accessible. This is someone else's book. It's not my time to
Yep.
shine when I want to
Sure.
when I want to write and
Yeah.
show off my writing skills. I will do it elsewhere. So the main point here is that this is for someone else. This is someone else's book.
Yeah.
And the most important part is to be accessible and easy to understand, and not having to engage too much like brain power for understanding what I'm writing. That said, I was thinking, if the same image was in a museum and I was to write a description, why not be more creative? Why not even use a poem?
Maybe it would follow the curatorial kind of lead.
Yeah.
Those sort of statements and write-ups that you're first confronted with when you walk into a new exhibition, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, there was a guideline by Akimbo that actually kind of suggested these creative and alternative ways of writing. Well, in this, it was also for me, it was selfish because I couldn't use the same, like a creative language. You have so many images in books that you cannot just be creative with each and every single image.
Yeah.
Then there's the process, like all the steps, but to be specific again about writing this alt text for books, there's that challenge of, every chapter presents a whole new world to you. So for each new image, I had to do a start over. Or on the other hand, in case of more voiceover, it was the repetitiveness of it. So it's kind of a behind the scenes work. Yeah. So that's another challenge. Like no one is going to give you a Pulitzer for writing alt text.
True.
But I think actually I find some fulfillment in doing these behind the scenes works.
Good.
Yes, very fulfilled now. And then there's the inherent difficulty of describing that I touched on earlier too, when I gave the example of getting low grades for visual analysis. We don't realize how challenging describing is. We like to interpret. We don't spend much of our time looking at something and describing the object. So
well, without imparting our own bias or our own interpretation, which I think were very good. You had very good and helpful and constructive ways of kind of approaching that problem. And I loved when you shared that example of the first art history assignment of just describing something and everybody got their worst grade, you know, like, is there one more slide or? Yeah, okay.
And then there's the conclusion for future considerations.
Yeah, so, you know, one thing I know that other publishers have been doing is that they've kind of try to determine their own sort of best suggested practices, knowing that there are a difficult kind of range of visual images within their own publishing programs. But that based on those considerations and those kinds of wranglings, they have often asked their authors to draft descriptions. And I think that that is often very helpful because the research component, for example, they're already the specialist in that text. They maybe have some information about objects that we wouldn't already know, or they would also have a better understanding of the nature of what's significant for that work. But then there could also be the issue that they're maybe too close to the material, or you also have to educate an author on what this medium is, right? And that's where I think it's great to have a long focus project like yours to help various publishers determine those kinds of recommendations to pass on to authors for their work. And I also I like that you're signaling here a participatory approach, which is working with other people and trying to figure out, like you were working with me and with Salem Twerdy, our editorial coordinator, to try to figure out, like, how do I wrangle with some of these difficult kinds of imagery. Sorry, please.
But I also actually, in the second point, I talk about having a collective and dynamic guideline. So that's what I'm talking about, is the collective nature of it. And it's important for it to be dynamic, because guidelines could be rigid. And as I said, it's an art form. It's not the most glamorous art, writing alt text, but it is an art. So it's important that it's dynamic, and we don't necessarily, it's not a Bible, or it's not something that we have to adhere to word by word. But by a participatory approach, I also mean whenever working with issues of access and accessibility, you have to work with the population you're trying to make things accessible for.
Yes.
And many times we were just like, when we were discussing, I was like, I wish there was someone who is actually a screen user and they screen reader user, and they could tell us, like,
does this
this
work
is
for you?
this
is helpful?
no,
Can you
like,
picture it?
So that's very important always, and actually putting people that you're working for front and center in general. And then the last point, also we were discussing about the tricky
sort of
AI.
Are people, some people, I think I've heard some rumblings about some people offloading it to generative AI, which will often do a kind of scoop of text preceding and then following an image, as well as the caption information. I feel like there's maybe a couple, it's almost like a double standard about generative AI amongst publishers, where they don't want to include it for traditional design work or editing, which, you know, they want it to be human verified, they want it to be human work. And they have dedicated suppliers and employees that are working in those areas. But then I noticed that whenever something about accessibility kind of came up, people were like, oh yeah, we should totally do generative AI for that. And I'm like, well, isn't that also human work? And when we are confronted with complex visuals like we just ran through, is that the best course of action? Or are we simply kind of saying, oh, well, for accessibility needs, this will be quick and fast, you know?
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about that?
I do. So actually, who to give this, because this is mainly my reflection, was like who to give this task to. I thought about maybe giving this task to authors, but then because they're the ones, they don't have to go and do this research, and they know why they've included this image. But at the same time, I thought, okay, the authors, they don't take joy. They're not there for writing alt text. You don't need to, these are scholars. You don't need to add necessarily more to their workload always. And at the same time, it might affect their choice. Like the author of Colin Campbell's voiceover might reconsider the number of images that book. I think I ended up writing the equivalent of an MA thesis describing the images. So you don't want that task to affect their decisions. So basically, well, you need to maybe pay someone to do it. And again, goes back into, well, let's not pay someone to do it. Let's just use AI. I think it's an ethical problem of us looking at technology as an extension of humans and human labor rather than a replacement, a substitution of humans and human labor. And I think I also showed how it's an artwork is sensitive. There's so many judgment calls that goes into it that I don't think necessarily an AI at this point would be successful at doing. There are things that now, as I said, it's like, okay, transcribing text. If you have access to programs that do it, or actually too late, I realized that actually they do transcribe text well.
Right, sure.
But again, not for free. So
There's that too.
There's that too. So maybe, I don't know, maybe someone can use AI as a help, as a tool, like a toolkit.
Yeah.
Maybe, but from what I see, my experience, I don't think that it could replace the actual work.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. I feel like we owe a debt of gratitude to Mehrnoosh Alborzi for this conversation and for all the work that you've done on our behalf, as well as for our authors and for our future readers. I'd also like to thank the Doggone Foundation for making your internship a paid internship, and congratulations on that application as well. I'm now, I think, let's just first all, a round of applause for Mehrnoosh. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rachel Harris, who will facilitate a question and answer. And if there are additional participants that are joining us here or that are online, we encourage you to share any other practices that you have or examples of any work that you have been doing.
Thank you so much. You can hear me, right? Yes, excellent. It's so wonderful to be working in parallel with the press, with our OER program, where we're also, there's a huge range of kinds of projects. With one of them, there was something like 80 images per chapter in an art history book, and others where there's fewer images. But before we get into the questions, there is coffee and juice. So if people need, Ryan, I see that your water is empty.
I did bring an additional bottle.
So if oh, you've come prepared. So if folks want to go over to the snack table for a minute and fill up on coffee, now's a good moment to do that as you think about your questions. No one wants snacks or coffee.
Someone should initiate. Okay.
For those joining on Zoom for the question and answer period, you're more than welcome to turn on your cameras, unmute yourselves, or use the chat for your questions, and we'll be sure to get those to our presenters. So please feel free to do that.
Do you need a refill?
Hmm?
Do you need a refill?
I know, I'm okay.
You're good.
I got one sip left.
See, I don't want to touch the plate.
Do you have questions?
Oh yeah, I
Yeah?
can start.
Yeah, why not?
Shall
Yeah,
I?
let's
Yeah,
go
I
for
have
it.
questions. Okay.
Please.
Okay.
So art books can be many things. They could be artist books, they could be coffee table books, they could be exhibition catalogs, they could be scholarly publishing written by an art historian. And so often when art historians write, there is visual analysis and description that is in the main body of the text. So do you have a specific approach to that in terms of how much description to write on top of the alt text when it's already ingrained into the fabric of the writing?
Yeah, that's a great question. That is something I encounter, especially in Canada's place names. The guidelines I found, they say, okay, don't repeat necessarily, but sometimes I thought, okay, maybe the person is just looking at the image, like you're flipping through in a way. So I try to avoiding repetition, still bringing in the most important parts of the description. But yeah, again, it's important, especially in the alt text, to avoid the repetition, or actually on the other hand, if that is what the author wants to talk about, it's the more important. Here again, you kind of repeat it as like an emphasis, like that thing that the author is talking about is here. That was my strategy in that book, but you would be surprised, there aren't that many necessary detailed descriptions as well. So depends on the author and depends what the image is there. So in the case that I encountered that, I kind of, that's why I say you have to make some judgment call of, should I bring it as an emphasis, or should I just be like, okay, it's there, I focus on other information. Yeah.
And how much do you engage the authors when making those judgments for those that are deeply embedded in the world of talking about art?
Yeah, I feel like that's something that we're going to have to do with the press, is
Yeah.
figuring out. I think that going forward, it's going to be that, based on the kind of findings of the sort of larger consultation that we've had from Mehrnoosh's research project, is that we want to build that more into the early stages of the development of a manuscript. So bringing the author in on that, once it's been approved for publication, once you're kind of starting to think about what final images will appear within the book. Often those are things that are, decided on what you can get for, rights, whether or not the permissions fees are too exorbitant or something like that. So it's once you kind of know what's really in it, but way prior to publication. That's the sort of planning there. Yeah, so Mehrnoosh wasn't working directly with the authors on this. It was kind of more like a choose your own adventure. I think like we kind of wanted to benefit from what she would learn from doing this as a singular focus project. Yeah.
I encountered these books after the fact. They were written, already published, but it would be a good idea maybe to start earlier.
Yeah.
I kind of had a conversation with the author through the book, you can say. Yeah. As I said, like I had to for some images, I kind of had to read the chapter to know already what's in there, why the image is there. Yeah.
Right. So we've got a question online.
Oh, okay.
From Kathleen Fraser.
We do have a question online. I can read it out. A question is coming from Kathleen Fraser, and the question is, so I'm curious about how others are handling alt text descriptions of color artworks that the book is reproducing in black and white.
Oh, that's a good one.
That is a good one.
Well, I guess, for this project, there would have been a mix of color images that were reproduced in color, but then there would also be black and white images that were originally color images. How much do we want to stick to the fidelity of the book's reproduction? I kind of feel like that's probably keeping us closer to the book's objectness, right? Rather than a description of the artist's work in its original form, right?
Yes, and actually exactly like 90% of my description started with black and white image of, because many of the images were black and white. So as you said, I stayed more true to the image in the book because that's what you see. And then whether the original artwork is in color or not, actually I just was writing an alt text for an image, and I went and researched that image just to see what it is, to make sure, for example, oh, it's a winter landscape, okay, just to make sure. But at the end of the day, the image was black and white, so I would just say black and white, but then with confidence I would describe it as a winter landscape because I had seen the original. But what you see is black and white image, so that's what I report. That's basically what you describe. You don't describe what you don't see.
Right. But yeah, my hunch is that we should reproduce what's being reproduced in the book.
Yeah.
I know that gets complicated, of course, if you are then doing a variant version, maybe there's a color option for the online version of the book, which might also be the one that's most going to benefit from text-to-speech readers.
Yeah.
So another good puzzle for us to work through. Thank you, Kathleen Fraser, managing editor over at McGill Queen's University Press.
Thank you.
Are there other general questions?
Any more questions online, or is there anyone in the audience with a question? Please raise your hand. You have a question?
But I think I've heard about the audience itself, and I've seen some kind of coat of arms of different. They have their own language describing these. I guess you might have different alt domain language to describe it, I guess, because you're talking about artboards, but they also have there is also out there specialized kind of
jargon
works, different kind of works. It might be the engineering, it might be the cultural works, it might be the artistic or other. So I guess you might use some different language, not specifically tied to the audience of the books per se, but different audience. For example, if you're on the website, you might end up having different kind of audience for the same picture.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Actually, that was kind of what we encountered with the coat of arms. As you said, there's a whole vocabulary associated with heraldry. I learned, and sometimes I would name it, as I said, I would say lion passant. I learned this word, but then I would say, well, lion rampant, and then I would be like, well, a standing lion. So I would use both terms for different audiences, and I included this less it's a very specialized term. I included it because there are so many, well, it is important, but at the same time, this book is not about heraldry, so I assume that the audience doesn't know. But when it was about architecture, I thought, okay, 90%, maybe the reader is an architect. So I didn't shy away from using, for example, the term pilotis, for example. But again, I would use pilotis or columns. So to give the option.
A sub-question.
Yeah, just a sub-question, more technical. I mean, can different language can coexist with the same image? You're talking about books, but I'm always I always keep in my mind online books, especially if we're talking about open access. It's easier. It's technically easier to digitally. So I guess that maybe in some near future we might have this kind of big structure that around images that's among the work itself, the describing work, the topics itself.
Right.
We have another question. You had a question?
Oh,
we have a question online from Sabrina Rack. Sabrina asks, so studio art students are now being taught about alt text and accessibility of their work when distributed online. Would you find it useful if artwork would be accompanied by the artist's own alt text, or is that something that publishers prefer to be in charge of?
Well, yeah, that poses another additional question is like, so Lionel Lemoyne Fitzgerald is sadly no longer with us. I mean, I think he died in the 50s or early 60s, and Colin Campbell died in the early 2000s. So I think often they're going to be posed with the problem, especially in art history writing, that the authors or the artists are no longer living. But it's interesting to think about like the long term for things like image banks for artists and how they might want to describe their works. There is, I think, an additional layer of complexity if we're going to pass it over to the artist, though, because they're maybe going to like their stake in the description and the interpretation of their work, I think is a lot higher than what it might be, say, as publishers or as art historians. Art
Yeah.
historians are going to have multiple perspectives on what an image is actually doing or what an artwork is actually doing. And publishers are going to be the ones who are probably encouraging art historians to keep diversifying those interpretations. So in some ways, I can see it maybe being an issue where the artist, how much say do they have over how we interpret a work,
Yeah.
right?
I actually encountered this. That was a great point because I encountered it in my art rating. And usually when we write for magazines, you don't necessarily share that text with the artist, but in this case, my text was shared with the artist at their request because you ask for example, the image rights. And they were like, oh, what you write, but because their stake is high, so they kind of want to, well, like, guided narrative, and then at some point, so that's kind of like a complex issue. Yeah, there's no answer to it, but yeah, what you said, I have experience with too. So yeah.
Thanks for such a well-considered talk on alt text. I've been working on a project for about a year, so a lot of the challenges that you faced and your solutions definitely like resonated with some of the work that I'm doing. One of the questions that I have from the presentation is a little bit of the follow-up with people who use the accessibility, the text-to-voice services. What have you heard from people?
Well, so far for this, we're still at the actual drafting stage. So I love your point though.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that we definitely want to do a consult with various stakeholders, people in the accessibility office here, just to see, is this working? You know, it's not just how do you picture it, but then can you picture it after we've done this work, right? Like, yeah, so if you're, or if anybody else here has any kind of experiences or things to share from reception, I definitely encourage you to discuss now or mention, and
that was a
please
great
keep in
question.
touch.
Thank you. Yeah, because that's something that we discussed. We approached the Concordia's accessibility office. Silent has kindly done so. So we have tried, but yeah, we are in the earlier stages, and definitely that's, as I said, like in work with any work regarding access and accessibility, you have to bring in, like, have a participatory approach. So yeah, if you share your experiences with us, that would be also very
Who's the end
interesting.
user? Yeah, share and share alike on this.
And then in part of the sharing publishing practices nature of the Q&A, I like to invite folks to turn to the person beside them with the considerations printed out, which I think have circulated, and maybe have a moment to say what area of publishing you're in or interested in, and whether any further questions emerge as a way of our last prompt for questions and answers before closing the presentation.
There's nothing else that comes to mind. I just say again to everybody.
Do we want to give folks a moment?
Do they have anything else coming up?
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
So the question I have for you is more like workflow metadata. So that you're looking at the behind the scenes of the project that was really intensive with images, 80 images per chapter. So in terms of structuring your workflow, in terms of what you're capturing data-wise, what does it look like on your end?
Oh, that's interesting. For structuring at the top. So because I'm doing this along with my, with structuring in how I structure the data or how I am structuring my kind of schedule.
The workflow.
The workflow. So I would just follow the book that I'm working on. And because I was doing it concurrently with my graduate studies and starting my graduate studies, actually that disrupted
Mhm.
my workflow heavily. But basically my approach was just soldiers.
Okay, so you don't have any kind of like template where you're, these are the titles, this is the file name, this is the.
It's still just
Oh,
text.
yeah, it's still
Yeah.
text. So that's because I'm not involved. And actually, when
Yeah.
we talk about participatory approach, there's the users, but there are also the people who code.
Yeah.
So that's not,
That'll be the next
That
stage
will
for
make
us to
sense.
take
Yeah,
care of.
yeah,
Yeah.
so
That'll be
that-
next year's talk.
yeah.
That'll
Happy to nerd out on with
Good.
you both.
be very fun.
Actually, that was something I considered because I was like, okay, with the description, with turning the visual data into a table. So I was like, oh, I wonder if it would have been nice if someone who would do the actual coding was there too. Yeah.
Okay, so have any further questions emerged? I see both of you were deep in conversation. Yeah.
This wasn't even, I mean, it kind of was prompted by the questions here. But in one of my classes, it's mandatory for my entire faculty. And one of the activities is writing alt text. And I have like quite a bit of training on it and I use accessibility software. And for quite a while, I've been kind of refraining from emailing my prof about how it isn't done enough justice within the course. And so I think I have to send that email to them tonight and be like, hey, can we review this for next time this course is administered, please? So that's what we were talking about.
Oh, thanks.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Amazing. Well, I'm glad that you got to exchange a little amongst yourselves, and it has been a delight to hear your conversation and to continue to work in parallel with our two very different publishing worlds as we delve into the realm of alt text for all kinds of publications.
I would like to I didn't get the chance to thank Ryan and Salen so much for their being there, your help. They're like wonderful people to work with.
Oh,
And
thanks.
thank you for accepting to supervise my internship. And also thanks to Elspeth McConnell for generously funding my internship. And
Oh,
thank you
thanks for working
everyone
with
for
us.
being here.
Thanks for sharing all this with
Thank
us. Really, really helpful. One more round of applause for Mehrnoosh and for Rachel.
Everyone.
Thank you, everybody online and in person. Thank you for space.
Thank you for space.
No, thank you. Thank you everyone for coming in. Thank you for both these great events. Thank you also, Rachel, for organizing this, as well as Ryan for putting this together. Mehrnoosh, it's great to have you in here. Those of you joining us online and on Zoom, we're going to be closing up the live stream now, but just want to let you know that the conversation remains available on our YouTube channel if you'd like to revisit it or share it, etc. And hope to see you again soon. Have a great